All right, so if you're following along in your textbook, we are in chapter 3, and we're looking at these biological molecules that are required to sustain life. So we're clear that these biological molecules are organic compounds. Okay, so the nature and importance of macromolecules in the chemistry of the cell. So we talked a lot already about the role of chemistry in our lives, and we said that all aspects of our lives are essentially chemical reactions taking place, right? So synthesis of biomacromolecules through condensation reactions is basically how we get these macromolecules being formed. We know that lipids and their subunits are very important when we think about the structure of the cell, right? We know that the plasma membrane is mostly made up of lipids, specifically the phospholipid. And we'll take a deeper look at that. Actually, I think in our next chapter, in chapter 4, we'll look at the biological membranes as we talk about the cell structure. But anyway, these organic molecules here that we're going to take a look at play very important roles in, like I said, the maintaining that plasma membrane integrity, the structure and function of our DNA, so those nucleic acids, polysaccharides and glucose as our major source of energy for the cell. So we're going to take a moment to just kind of walk through these 4 classes of biological molecules, okay? Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So the building blocks, as I just mentioned a few moments ago, are essentially these 4 chemical elements that we said were most abundant in living things. So we talked about the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen being the chemical elements that make up about 96% of the mass of living things. And so in this lesson today, we'll take a look at how these chemical elements interact together to form these larger, more complex molecules. All right, we're understanding most importantly that these are organic substances. All right, organic building blocks are responsible for the synthesis of these larger, more complex molecules. All right, all of these organic molecules are going to contain carbon, okay, at its foundation. All right, all organic substances contain carbon. All right, we'll also see these oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sometimes sulfur being present, all right? But we're clear here that these carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are the most abundant chemical elements found in living things. And we're going to take a look today and see how they make up our large, complex macromolecules, all right? So the major classes of organic compounds that are required to sustain life are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. Jot those down. And what I want you to be able to tell me by the end of this lesson is, what is the basic unit for making up each of these organic molecules? All right, so these are large, complex molecules, which tells us that they're being synthesized or made from smaller monomers, smaller subunits that are joining together to form these larger, more complex molecules. All right, so we want you to think about, as we're going through this, how do these smaller subunits combine together to form these larger, more complex molecules? Okay, where in the cell can we find these molecules? Okay, what are the functions of these molecules in our bodies? Like, why do we need carbohydrates? Why do we need proteins? Why do we need lipids? All right. So by the end of this lesson, we should be able to answer some of these basic questions, okay? The basic unit, which is basically the building block, like what are carbohydrates synthesized from? What are the monomers that make up these carbohydrates, which are large, complex biological molecules? And so what I'm saying is that each of these compounds that we're talking about are complex macromolecules that we refer to as polymers. Write the term polymer down. Right? These micromolecules are referred to as polymers, right? Which tells us that these are large, complex molecules that have been synthesized from smaller, more simple subunits that we call monomers, okay? Jot down the term monomer, okay? You should have a basic understanding of what is the difference between a monomer and a polymer. Okay, just looking at our prefixes that we need to get a habit of looking into in biology. Prefixes tells us a little bit about words, even if we don't really know what they are. But we see this prefix mono, and mono means one. Okay, so we have these monomers that serve as building blocks, or subunits that can make up these larger, more complex molecules that we refer to as polymers. Okay, polymers. So let's start here with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, this is a class of compounds that usually contains carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. All right, these are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are one of the most important classes of molecules that we can require for sustaining life, because they are the major source of energy. All right, so the chemical elements that make up these carbohydrates, again, are going to be our carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We're going to always see these in the chemical formula for carbohydrates. All right, and so there are various examples of carbohydrates. You know about the starches, the sugars, glycogen, cellulose. You've heard about them all, right? And so we're understanding that these are the major source of energy, right, for our bodies, right? Glycogen is a complex polysaccharide that's created in animals for basically storing energy, all right? These are long-term storage molecules, all right? We get these carbohydrates mostly by consuming foods in the form of starches and sugars, all right? Glycogen is our storage form, and then we got this guy here, cellulose, all right? We're gonna put an asterisk by the cellulose because there's something unique about it. Animals don't consume cellulose, okay? Write that down. It's a different type of a polysaccharide that we're not consuming, all right? Cellulose is a polysaccharide that's going to be found in the structure of the cell wall structure of a plant, all right? Our bodies don't have the enzymatic capability to digest cellulose, okay? So we do not consume cellulose as we would our starches and sugars and so forth. So carbohydrates, they can exist as simple or more complex. So we have our monosaccharides and our disaccharides, which are formed by joining together two or more monosaccharides, all right? Monosaccharides and disaccharides are referred to as our simple sugars. Write that term down. I'm sure you've heard of it before. Monosaccharides, disaccharides are simple sugars, all right? But we continue to add more and more complex subunits to this complex. We have a more complex carbohydrate that we'll call a polysaccharide, okay? So we have our monosaccharides, disaccharides, and then we have polysaccharides, which have many simple subunits joined together, all right? So carbohydrates can exist in many forms. Let's look at some. So simple carbohydrates, there's usually going to be one or two sugar units in a simple carbohydrate, a monosaccharide. An example of a monosaccharide is glucose. You go ahead and write that down. Glucose, the formula C6H12O6. You're very familiar with this sugar. All right, this is an example of a simple carbohydrate or a monosaccharide. Has one sugar unit, okay? Disaccharides can be formed when we join together two or more monosaccharides, okay? Oh yes, glucose, we know, is a product of photosynthesis. So this is something that should not be very new to you, all right? If we join together two or more monosaccharides, we form disaccharides, right? This is still an example of a simple sugar, all right? For example, sucrose here. Sucrose is formed when we join together two monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, all right? Sucrose is the name for table sugar. Table sugar is formed from joining together glucose and fructose, okay? Now, if we continue to join together many sugar units, we can create what we call complex carbohydrates. These polysaccharides are formed from joining together many monosaccharide units together. All right. These complex carbs, again, are going to include our starch, cellulose, and glycogen. So I mentioned earlier that glycogen is the sort of the storage form, a storage form of energy in animals. Okay, we're clear that this is in contrast to the cellulose that I mentioned earlier. We don't consume cellulose. This is also a complex carb that's basically a structural polysaccharide that's found in the cell wall of plants. Okay. Our next class of biological molecules are proteins. All right. We hear about proteins from day to day. Okay. These are very important, very large molecules that have various shapes or conformations. Okay. They can fold and form various conformations. Okay. And these various shapes or conformations that they exist in can influence their function. Most importantly, we know that proteins are responsible for giving cells their jobs, right? There are thousands and thousands of different specialized cell types in our bodies. And each of these cell types derive their specific function based on the protein expression profile at any given moment in this cell, right? So we're clear that all of our cells have the same genome, right? They have the same genetic material, the same DNA, the same number of genes. However, the protein expression profile, which proteins are being expressed at any given time, is going to then dictate the actual specialized function of the cell. Okay, so there are thousands of different proteins in each of the different cell types, right? One example of a protein here is casein that's found in milk. I mentioned protein structure, all right? There are 4 different levels of organization for the protein that it can be arranged in its primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary structure, okay? We'll take a look at those in a little bit more detail here shortly. Jot those down. So the first level of organization here for proteins is the primary shape or primary structure. And the primary structure of the protein simply refers to the linear sequence of amino acids, right? So in this case, you're jotting down that amino acids are the monomers or the building blocks for proteins, all right? So I mentioned earlier that each of these classes of biological molecules are made from smaller subunits. So the smaller subunit that joins together and makes proteins are amino acids, okay? So amino acids are the monomers for proteins. Different proteins have different sequences of amino acids. So again, if we continue to work backwards and try and relate structure to function, then the structure and the arrangement of amino acids, or the sequence or arrangement of amino acids in this primary structure, is going to dictate the function of our protein. And so you've heard of this term amino acids before. There are 20 different amino acids that are naturally occurring. Okay. And so again, we're wanting you to understand here that depending on the arrangement and organization of these 20 different amino acids, that's going to dictate our final protein product. All right. If we see here the setup of an amino acid, we see we have an amino group over here. We have a carboxyl group over here. We've certainly got some hydrogen, and then we got our R chain of the amino acid. So we see here those 4 chemical elements that we talked about, all right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, all right? I mentioned this back in our section on chapter 2, where we talked about those abundant amino acids, and I said that abundant chemical elements, sorry. I said that we saw nitrogen as a major requirement in our protein synthesis, right? Because we have these amino groups where nitrogen is a part of these amino groups. So the primary shape of a protein, we said, is created by the joining together of amino acids in a linear sequence. All right. When we join together many amino acids, we form a polypeptide. All right. So when you're reading through your book or other literature, you may see the term polypeptide used interchangeably with the word protein. Right? We join together amino acids in order to create a protein. Okay. But in a simple term, that polypeptide, it's sort of an unfinished protein, because some proteins can undergo some final processing and so forth to become a final functioning protein product. And so we refer to that linear chain of amino acids as a polypeptide chain. All right. In chapter 2, we talked a little bit about bonds, chemical bonds. An important bond here when we talk about protein synthesis is the peptide bond. Write down the word peptide bond. Okay. Peptide bonds hold together adjacent amino acids. Peptide bonds hold together adjacent amino acids. Okay, so we've got amino acid number 1 here joining together to join amino acid number 2, and that force is being held together through a peptide bond. All right, so do jot that down. As I mentioned before, this is just a visual that shows us that our primary structure of a protein is due to the linear assembly of amino acids. And we've got our carboxyl group on one side, and we've got the amino group on the other end. We've got an amino acid here. We've got these amino acids joined together by peptide bonds. Okay. So we got a primary structure of a protein, but then we also have a secondary structure. So those amino acids that are assembling together or joining together via peptide bonds can sort of fold or bend in different ways, right? So we get the secondary structure of a protein when we have these amino acids folding and arranging themselves in sort of different arrangements, all right? An example of a secondary structure of a protein is the alpha helix. Alpha helix, beta pleated sheets. You've probably seen these random coils before in various pictures or illustrations of a protein. All right. So these are examples of secondary structures of proteins. Write them down. All right. Secondary structures or secondary shapes of a protein are created when these chains of amino acids begin to fold. Okay. This is an example of an alpha helix. Okay, you've probably seen a structure very similar to this when you look at the structure of like DNA. All right, DNA is referred to structurally as a double helix, and what it is just two strands of nucleotides that sort of wind around each other in this sort of spiral or helical formation, and so we refer to it as a double helix. All right, in this case, we're looking at a secondary structure that is an alpha helix. All right. Excuse me. Other examples of secondary structures in proteins are beta pleated sheets. Beta pleated sheets, where you basically see these amino acids arranged in a sheet-like folded arrangement with pleats. Okay, if you've ever like folded a piece of paper to create like a paper fan, you create these pleats in this paper. This is what we look and see with a beta pleated sheet. Okay, and then these random coils, I'm sure you've seen these arrangements before to represent another type of secondary structure that are found in proteins. So the coiling. Tertiary structure is when we have the interaction of two different primary amino acid chains, adjacent amino acid chains interacting together. Quaternary structure, again, we have the interaction of multiple primary chains of amino acids. Okay, so we have an alpha chain, that's one chain of amino acids here, one polypeptide chain. We have a beta chain here, which is in a different peptide chain. And quaternary structure is basically when we have the interaction of multiple polypeptide chains interacting together. We get this complex quaternary structure. And so proteins, they all have very important jobs, okay? If there is a job to be done in the molecular world of our cells, usually that job is done by a protein, right? All of our function and being are determined or regulated by the presence of proteins, right? There are different types of proteins. Let's look at some examples of proteins and what their jobs are. Jot some of these down. Examples: hormones. Hormones are proteins, okay? They function by acting as messengers. They send messages, okay? An example of a protein hormone is insulin, right? You've all heard about insulin before. Insulin is a product that our body produces in order to regulate our blood sugar, right? So these hormones, right, this insulin is released in response to high blood sugar, right? And it helps to regulate or remove this sugar from our blood. Okay, so hormones are an example of proteins. Okay, an example of a hormone is insulin. Proteins can also function as enzymes, right? We know that by definition, enzymes are biological catalysts that function to speed up chemical reactions, right? So we mentioned already back in chapter 1 when we talked about metabolism and the different types of chemical reactions that go on in our bodies. That's what's happening all day, just series of reactions of anabolic reactions, catabolic reactions, and enzymes that play a very important role in these reactions being able to take place by speeding up these reactions and basically lowering the activation energy that's required to get these chemical reactions underway. Proteins can also function as cell receptors, okay, acting as antennae. So again, they're sending signals, communication between cells, between the cell and the environment, or cell-to-cell communication. Proteins can function as antibodies, membrane channels, allowing for certain substances to pass through the membrane and get into the cell, to enter or leave the cell. Okay, so there are a number of different examples of types of proteins and what their jobs are. So do jot a few of these down. Okay. And so, again, we're clear that these proteins are very important classes of biological molecules because they're essentially dictating cellular function and cellular activity, okay? And so we're saying that these proteins are large, complex molecules that are built from monomers of amino acids, right? Our monomers for proteins, or our building blocks, or our subunits here that make up proteins, are going to be amino acids, right? And we said that these amino acids are held together by peptide bonds, right? And so you, as you're reading your textbook and other literature, you may see these proteins also being referred to as polypeptides. I lost my slide. Okay. Again, usually multiple peptide chains join together, and that's how we get our, complex quaternary structure of a protein. All right, let's keep moving. There's different types of proteins. The globular proteins have a number of roles in the body, including, motility, locomotion, regulatory proteins, membrane proteins. They all have various roles in our bodies, right? Structural proteins such as keratin, that's found in our hair, fingernails. You've heard of collagen before. It's an important protein in our skin. Myosin, muscle proteins. Okay, so these are all examples of types of proteins, all right? Classes of proteins and examples, all right? Let's see here. Lipids, all right? Lipids, so we don't run out of time here. Lipids are the next class of biological molecules that we need to sustain life. Okay, lipids are going to be those fats and oils that you hear about. Okay, these are another class of organic compounds that are made from our oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, right? Those carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen elements that we talked about. We know that lipids have very poor affinity for water. These are hydrophobic molecules. They're typically going to be water insoluble, okay, non-polar. All right. We know that lipids have a very important structural role in the cell, right? As the plasma membrane is composed mostly of phospholipids. This is a specific type of lipid that has some very important properties of being amphipathic, because it's going to have that polar and non-polar compartment in the same molecule, right? So we've got a phospholipid where we have a polar head and a non-polar tail, and it is these phospholipids that make up the plasma membrane, right? And so why are these lipids important? Lipids are important because they are the long-term storage form of energy, okay? So we store energy in our fat cells, all right? Our primary source of energy, we said, are going to come from our carbohydrates, and we hopefully replenish those every day in the foods that we eat, all right? And they're readily available for short-term use of our energy. However, energy can be stored and accessed from our fat molecules, these lipids, all right? This is one of the premises of the ketogenic diet, keto diet. So if your body is depleted of those carbohydrates, right? If you deprive your body of carbohydrates, it will essentially start to burn and utilize the energy that's stored in your fat. All right. That's a very unsafe diet, by the way. If any of you guys are on a keto diet, it is not very safe. Okay. Definitely check with your healthcare provider or primary care physician before you embark on a journey such as keto. Okay, it does work though. If you deprive your body of carbohydrates, which is essentially what keto diet does, it's a carb-free diet, your body will start to burn fat. Okay, so lipids are the long-term energy storage in animals, right? Let's look at the subunits for lipids. Fats are composed of the subunits, fatty acids or glycerols, right? Triglycerides are common forms of fat. I'm sure you've heard about triglycerides before. If you've ever had your, blood work done and blood panels, you will see your triglycerides as your doctor is trying to assess your cholesterol and so forth, all right? Those triglycerides have a single glycerol unit with fatty acid side chains coming off the side here. Okay. So this is an example of a triglyceride. As I mentioned before, these fats are going to be water insoluble. All right. So we refer to them as hydrophobic. Write that term down, hydrophobic. Okay, so we're talking about oils and water are not going to be a homogeneous mixture. You've probably seen the simple chemistry experiments where you mix oil and water together. They will not mix into a homogeneous mixture. Okay. Oils, the fats, we know, they come in various forms, right? We have our liquids and our solids, all right, at room temperature. But nonetheless, these are all going to be organic compounds that are, they contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. They're made from the glycerol or fatty acids as the building blocks, or the monomers that make up lipids, right? And they have very important roles in, again, long-term storage forms of energy, and also in the structure of the plasma membrane, all right? And by nature, they're going to be hydrophobic, all right? Special type of lipid here I mentioned earlier are the phospholipids. All right, phospholipids are a major component of the cell membrane. Definitely jot that down. All right, we'll take a look at this phospholipid molecule a little bit more when we get into chapter 4, but right now, for the purpose of understanding the significance of these classes of biological molecules and the roles that they play, phospholipids make up our cell membrane, right? And we know that all living things are made up of cells, and that cell membrane sort of serves as the first layer of protection, first barrier, around the cell that's separating the inside of the cell from the outside environment, right? So this plasma membrane is a super important structure on the cell that has to be maintained with integrity, right? So we'll come back to that. All right, so this is an example or some illustrations of a phospholipid. I mentioned earlier that the structure of the phospholipid is a property of the phospholipid is that it is amphipathic, right? So we've got this hydrophilic head and these hydrophobic tails. And I mentioned in terms of that cell membrane being a phospholipid bilayer, and it's basically like two layers of phospholipids interacting together, forming like this sheet-like barrier around the cell, right? So we've got these polar hydrophilic heads that interact with the aqueous environment, right? But then we have these hydrophobic tails that are going to be tucked into the middle, okay, of this bilayer, right, away from water, right? So we have a phospholipid bilayer as the major structure of the cell membrane. All right, this is another illustration of what the cell membrane looks like in the presence of these phospholipids. All right, so we've got a layer of phospholipids here, and then we've also got a layer of phospholipids here, right, where we have our hydrophilic heads facing the external environment where there's usually going to be fluid or water, right? So these are hydrophilic heads. And then we've got these hydrophobic tails that are buried in the middle, creating that barrier, right? And then we've got our other layer of phospholipids here facing the internal environment, which is also going to be an aqueous environment. And so this structure right here, if you can just imagine in a sort of 2D or 3D manner, it forms the outer barrier of the cell, okay? A phospholipid bilayer, write that down. The structure of the cell is a phospholipid bilayer. The structure of the cell membrane, excuse me. All right. All right, our last class of biological molecules are nucleic acids, all right? Nucleic acids are very large macromolecules that are concerned with the storage and transmission of inherited information, right? And protein synthesis. So we are talking about DNA and RNA as our examples of nucleic acids. There are two types, DNA and RNA. We know that DNA is responsible for the transmission, or it is the form of genetic material that is transmitted from parent to offspring, right? Our DNA, right? We know that DNA is located in the nucleus of the cell, right? Another type of nucleic acid is RNA, okay, ribonucleic acid. Now this molecule is a little bit different structurally and functionally. Structurally is single stranded, right? While DNA is double stranded. But these RNA molecules are play an important role in protein synthesis, and it basically serves as a message for protein synthesis. And so these RNA molecules are synthesized from the information or template of information that's found in our DNA. Okay, so we'll get to a unit where we'll talk about the central dogma of biology, and it tells us how information moves from DNA to RNA to protein, right, as our functional product for our cells, right? So in this case, DNA sort of is the inherited information that is passed down from parent to offspring, right? And then it's that DNA that now serves as the instructions for synthesizing RNA. Right? And then RNA, specifically our messenger RNA that we'll talk about, will be used to produce our proteins, right? So RNA is an important piece of the puzzle for protein synthesis, right? The building blocks of nucleic acids are nucleotides, right? So nucleic acids are synthesized or made up from the smaller subunits known as nucleotides. Write this term down, nucleotides. All right. So again, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to tell me what the building blocks are for each of these classes of biological molecules, what the functions of these biological molecules are, where are they found in the cell, okay? Each nucleotide, right, which is a subunit or a monomer of a nucleotide, of a nucleic acid, is made, it contains 3 components: a sugar group, phosphate group, and a base. All right. Each nucleotide, each monomer is made up of a sugar group, a phosphate group, and one of 4 nitrogenous bases, or 5 nitrogenous bases. So the nucleotides, so there's 2 types, right? We've got DNA, we've got RNA, okay? DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, and you should know how to spell that. And it's going to contain 4 nitrogenous bases, A, T, G, and C. You've seen these before, I'm sure. And so these bases pair. Okay, there's a complementary base pairing that happens between these nitrogenous bases in adjacent nucleotides. Okay, so A pairs with T and G pairs with C. So this complementary base pairing, or these interactions between these bases, are what's going to be responsible for the formation of that double helix structure that I referred to earlier as the structure of DNA. It is a double helix. This double helix is formed when we have our 2 strands of nucleotides sort of winding around each other in a spiral formation in order to create a double helix. Okay, you should familiarize yourself with the rules of complementary base pairing, okay, in nature. Now, we know that things can go awry sometimes, and that's what we get when we have mutations. But in nature, A pairs with T and G pairs with C. All right, so this is a strand of nucleotides. We'll call it a polynucleotide, right? This polynucleotide, as we said, one nucleotide contains 3 parts, right? A sugar group, phosphate group, and a base, or sugar, phosphate, and base, all right? This is one nucleotide right here. You should certainly take some time this week and look back over the structure of our nucleic acid and a nucleotide, right? And so we have many different nucleotides being joined together, all right, to make up our strand of nucleotides to form DNA. Okay. Let's see, what else do we want to get to here? Okay, and then so that's DNA, and so then RNA, the ribonucleotides, are structurally and functionally different than DNA, right? RNA, there are different types of RNA, right? There's messenger RNA, ribosomal RNA, and transfer RNA. Okay, do take a look back at this when you get a moment. But the most important type of RNA that I do want to highlight today are messenger RNA, and they are responsible for carrying genetic messages, right, from the nucleus in order to facilitate protein synthesis, right? So DNA is transcribed into RNA, and then that RNA is translated into protein. And so we'll go into a little bit more detail about that in another chapter about transcription and translation and how we take the information that's found in our DNA in order to make RNA, which is sort of an intermediate molecule before we actually make proteins. All right. So I'm going to stop here. I know this was a lot of information, but I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. What I do want you to think about or